Good morning. It's good to see you this Palm Sunday. I'm going to start by reading the story of the first Palm Sunday from Luke's Gospel. It begins in chapter 11 at verse 1, if you'd like to follow it in your own Bible. As Jesus and his disciples approached Jerusalem and came to Bethphage and Bethany at the Mount of Olives, Jesus sent two of his disciples, saying to them, "Go to the village ahead of you, and just as you enter it, you will find a colt tied there which no one has ever ridden. Untie it and bring it here. If anyone asks you, 'Why are you doing this?' say, 'The Lord needs it, and will send it back here shortly.'" They went and found a colt outside in the street, tied at a doorway. As they untied it, some people standing there asked, "What are you doing untying that colt?" They answered as Jesus had told them to, and the people let them go. When they brought the colt to Jesus and threw their cloaks over it, he sat on it. Many people spread their cloaks on the road, while others spread branches they had cut in the fields. Those who went ahead and those who followed shouted, "Hosanna! Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Blessed is the coming kingdom of our father David. Hosanna in the highest heaven." Jesus entered Jerusalem and went into the temple courts. He looked around at everything, but since it was already late, he went out to Bethany with the 12. Now, I don't know about you, but I've been enormously impressed at the speed at which the enormous Nightingale Hospital has been prepared for use so that it could open this week. It took just 2 weeks. London's need for a 4,000-bedded intensive care hospital was not even dreamed of a month ago, and it represents both a hope and a horror that such a thing should be necessary. And yet we know that a storm is gathering, and the peak of the coronavirus epidemic in the UK is coming towards us inexorably. We are aware, perhaps, of a growing sense of dread of what might happen. Will our preparations be enough? Will our quarantine have made enough difference? Will our health service cope? In the chapters of Mark's Gospel that lead up to the story of Palm Sunday, there is a sense of a coming storm there too. There's a sense of gathering dread. The writer is not concerned with the coming of an epidemic, but with the gradual revealing of somebody who is going to profoundly challenge those who hold power in Israel. As the first 8 chapters unfold, Jesus is speaking God's words and he's performing miraculous healings. So far, he's like a prophet. He's like Moses or Elijah. But we know Jesus is so much more than that. He's actually an anointed king, the anointed one, the Messiah or the Christ, as he's called in Hebrew or in Greek. He is the one that the prophets have been speaking of for centuries. But one of the strange things in Mark is that Jesus continually tries to keep his messiahship a secret. When he's healed many people, he asks them to keep quiet about what's happened because he doesn't want too many people to know. He knows he has a job to do and he doesn't want things to come to a head too quickly. He needs to teach his disciples all about what his kingdom consists of. He needs to demonstrate it in his teaching and in his healings. And if it comes out too soon that he's the Messiah, then everything could come to a head and all his training of his disciples would have to stop. As we get to the end of chapter 8, though, Peter is beginning to realize who Jesus really is. He tells Jesus that the people have realized that Jesus is a prophet, but that he, Peter, recognizes that Jesus is the Christ, the Messiah. But straight away after that realization from Peter, Jesus points out what this will mean, and it's not good. Being known as the Messiah will mean suffering and death for him. Peter reacts, as all of us do, as we first encounter really uncomfortable truth. He wants to deny it. He wants to deny that Jesus' messiahship inevitably involves suffering. Perhaps that's a bit like how we were at the beginning of this epidemic. We wanted to deny what was happening and not really take it seriously. But Jesus is not in denial. He's fully aware of what's happening. And he starts travelling towards Jerusalem, the centre of religious and political power. And 3 times in the next 2 chapters, after the end of chapter 8, he repeats his prophecy that he is going to suffer and die and rise from the dead. He knows that the revelation of who he really is going to bring growing conflict with the authorities, and that it's going to come to a head. I imagine, as Jesus talks about this, that he must be feeling a mixture of euphoria and dread, much as a friend of mine who used to be in the forces described to me as how she felt when she knew she was going to be going to a war zone. She spoke of a sense of euphoria that she is at last doing what she's been trained for, and that she was going to be doing a job with her team which fulfilled their destiny. But also beneath that, she recognised that she had a deep sense of dread and an awareness of the seriousness of what they were doing and how it might end in death. So I suspect Jesus has such similar mixed feelings. He feels joy that ultimately he will go with his Father, but he's also very aware that the road to get there is really hard. He's also aware that he needs to let people know before he dies who he really is. He has to reveal himself fully to the public gaze. He has to let them know that he's not just a prophet. He is a king who is coming to take possession of his kingdom. He has to show people what's really going on. And as Mark builds his story, he gives us a really lovely little preview of what's going to happen. As Jesus passes through Jericho on his way to Jerusalem, he meets blind Bartimaeus. And Bartimaeus, the blind beggar, realizes who he is. He calls Jesus Son of David, which means that he's the Messiah. It's a lovely little twist in the story that the first person outside Jesus' immediate circle who knows who he really is a blind beggar. I love that. But that's Jericho. Jesus is heading towards Jerusalem, to the centre of power, and that's where he needs to go. And I imagine as he's going there, he's planning in his mind how he's going to do his entrance, how he's going to tell everybody that he's a king. So how do you tell people that you're now in charge? Well, this picture shows how Hitler did it on March the 12th, 1938, with a huge procession. The people of Salzburg saw Hitler's staff cars rolling in along their streets and huge banners with swastikas on them hanging from the public buildings. They didn't need anyone to explain what this meant. Hitler was clearly signalling that he was in charge now. Jesus does something similar as a proclamation of his kingship. Not that his rule was going to be anything like Hitler's, of course, but he uses very public, symbolic action, like Hitler did, to tell people loud and clear who is in charge. So as he plans his entrance, he decides it needs to be from the Mount of Olives, because that's where the Messiah is due to come from. And in this picture, the photographer is standing on the Mount of Olives, looking down the hill into the Kidron Valley, and then up the other side, where in this modern day picture we can see the gold dome of the Dome of the Rock, which is a mosque that's been built on the site of the old Jewish temple. Just below that gold dome you can see the city wall stretching from side to side. At that point it's the city wall, it's the wall of the temple as well as the wall of the city. So you can see that as Jesus was entering Jerusalem from the Mount of Olives, he must have had a very large audience. It was very visible what he was doing. Many pilgrims would have gone the way that he went, but they would have gone on foot. Jesus decides to come in on a donkey because that's the action of a king. And Mark gives us other details that reinforce the fact that Jesus is saying very clearly, I am a king. The interaction with the owners of the donkey is the interaction of a ruler. Those in charge in those days had a right to requisition the transport they needed. They had a right to say, I need to use your donkey, and people couldn't object. And in addition, in choosing a donkey that hasn't been ridden before, Jesus is saying that he is a religiously pure king, a religious king. In other words, he's saying, I am the Messiah. And the people around him are joining in with the proclamation. Those watching from Jerusalem, from the other side of the valley, will have seen that though Jesus was being greeted like all pilgrims with palm branches and words from Psalm 118, he was being given much more of a welcome than that of an ordinary pilgrim. He was being given the red carpet treatment, in fact, or in this case, a carpet of cloaks. And the words that the people were shouting were significant. They were saying, blessed is the coming kingdom of our father David. They were saying, the kingdom we've longed for centuries is here. We're going back as if we're going back to the time of David when everything was fine, everything was good, because David was the best king we ever had. This is his descendant who's going to start a new kingdom that's just like the one that David had. And they're asking Jesus to do the things that kings would do. They're saying, save us. That's what Hosanna means. They're getting carried away with the excitement of the moment. They're longing for release from the Romans, and they're pinning their hopes on Jesus to do it. But the story ends on a surprisingly quiet note. Unlike Hitler, Jesus hasn't brought columns of military personnel in his procession. Unlike the Romans, he's not come with legions of violent soldiers. We're told he simply enters Jerusalem, goes to the temple, has a look round, and then, because it's late, he decides to go back to Bethany to stay with his friends, Mary, Martha and Lazarus, we assume. He leaves his next move until the next day. He lets the impression he has given sink in overnight, and then the next day he starts his coup. And he starts it by clearing out all the traders in the temple and standing up and teaching there, so that the authorities come and say, what are you doing? By whose authority do you do this? And then he tells them. He tells the chief priests and the rulers of the law the most confrontational parable of all, that says that some of them will kill him, and those who do will be thrown out of God's vineyard. He is utterly uncompromising. He is deliberately aggravating the authorities, and he's provoking them into a showdown. He knows full well what will happen. He knows that now he's come out of hiding, they will kill him. He knows that now that he is revealing who he really is, they won't be able to tolerate it. But the truth has to come out. He has finally to show people that he is truly the king, whose arrival has been prophesied for centuries. He's the king sent by God, and though he knows they will kill him for it, he still rides a donkey into Jerusalem and then walks clear-eyed towards his enemies, standing tall. He's such a hero. But 5 days later, he's dead. It looks like his reign as king was the shortest ever. But as we know, that's not the end of the story. He's actually still on a journey, even though he's supposedly dead. His journey takes him to Hades, the place of the dead, to release those who are imprisoned there. And then when he's finished there, he bursts from the tomb, showing everyone he's the conqueror of death, before he shows his disciples the full extent of his glory as he ascends to the position of honour that truly belongs to him, a seat at the right hand of God the Father. He's gone ahead as a pioneer, you see, creating a new path where there wasn't one before, a path through death into resurrection and the glory of God's presence. In the First World War, my grandfather was a reconnaissance officer for a tank regiment. And in those days, the drivers of tanks couldn't see out of their tanks forwards. They could only see downwards at the road beneath the tank. So the night before the tanks were due to go forward into battle, the reconnaissance officers had to go ahead and lay a tape on the ground that the tanks would be able to follow the next day. It was very dangerous work because these reconnaissance officers had to go forward in the dark, crawling up to the enemy lines, laying their tape. And then they had to get away without being seen or shot. My grandfather wrote in his diary about laying the tape. It was a rotten job, although the Boche was quiet. My clothes got torn to pieces getting through the wire, and it was very difficult to find the pegs in the dark and keep the right direction. My grandfather did this the night before the Battle of Amiens, the one which turned the tide of the First World War, in August 1918. He went ahead, laid the tape, and then led his tanks through to victory. And as we face this wave of epidemic that is coming towards us, Jesus leads us through. He's our reconnaissance officer. He has been this way before. He's been through everything that evil could throw at him. Clear-eyed, he walked towards the suffering and execution that he knew awaited him, not hiding, not pretending, not denying, knowing how awful it would be, but going through with it, in his case, right through death and out the other side into new life and glory. And now, if we place our hands in his, he will lead us through this difficult time of this pandemic. It will be hard. It may involve much loss. But he knows the way. As he told his disciples in John's Gospel, he has gone ahead to prepare a place for us, and he promised to come back and take us to be with him. As King George VI said in his famous speech at Christmas 1939, as the realities of the Second World War were beginning to bite, "Go out into the darkness and put your hand into the hand of God. That shall be to you better than light and safer than a known way." God bless you as you go through with him.